Welcome to another chess session. Today we're going to be talking about special moves in chess. So the first one we're going to talk about is called pawn promotion. So as you can see on the screen, when the pawn, which is on e7, reaches the 8th rank, e8, it can be promoted into a queen, a rook, a bishop, a knight, except it can't remain being a pawn or promoted into a king. So when the pawn reaches on the other side of the board, for example, it started from e2. When it reaches on e8, it's promoted into another piece. This is what we call pawn promotion. So at the beginning, I can start from e2 to e4, then later on just move one square forward until I reach the 8th rank, which will promote it into any piece that you want. So the second move, it's called en passant, or in the, it's a French term that says, which means in passing. So this example shows the pawn on e2, if it moves from e2 to e4. So the pawn on f4 can capture, as the arrow is showing, going to e3. So it won't, normally when you're capturing pieces, it's supposed to occupy the square where the previous piece was. But in this case of en passant, you move to a different square. So the pawn moved from e2 to e4. Then the capture pawn was from f4 to e3. So that's how the pawn was captured. If the white pawn moves 2 squares, the black can capture. So the third, I'm sorry, this is how when the pawn is captured looks like. So remember, initially the pawn was here on e2. So the other pawn was on, the white pawn was on e2, the black pawn was on f4. So after it moved to e4, this is how it moved, looks when it captured using en passant. So in this case, it's the same thing. Black moves 2 squares. So the pawn adjacent to it can capture it. So it goes to g6. So the other move, it's called castling. So we have two sides of castling. We have the queen side, the king side, and the queen side. So the arrows are showing the queen side castling. So you move the king 2 squares to the right, then the rook moves 2 squares to the left. Even on king side castling, it's the same thing. So you move 2 squares to the right, except in this case, this rook will move, just jump over the king to occupy the next, the square which is close to the king. So this is how it's castled on the queen side. When this is how it looks when the castling is done on the queen side. And then this is how it looks when you do the king side castling. So it's the same, 2 squares, then the rook jumps over. Queen side castling. When there are pieces controlling the squares where the king can castle, like in this case we have a black bishop, white bishop on b5, it's controlling the white diagonal. When I say diagonal, meaning all the white squares where the bishop is pointing towards. So up to f1, the king can't castle because it's going to castle in check. You can't castle when you're in check. The other special move we have, it's called checkmate. In this case, there's a stalemate and a checkmate. So in this case, if it's black to play, black has got no, the black king has got no legal move to go to. So it can't move to h7 because it's going to be checked with the queen. It can't move to g8, it's going to be still checked with the queen, and it can't go to g7, it's going to be checked with the queen. So if in this instant, if it's black to play, then it's a stalemate. It's called a stalemate or a draw. So be careful how you move pieces. This is another draw. When you have no pieces other than the king, the two kings on the board, it's a draw also. So this draw is called, it's a draw by insufficient material. There's no mating material on the board. There are no pieces that you can use for attacking the king, and two kings can never attack each other. There's always one square in between the two kings. So this king on e3 can go on d3. This king on, the black king on e5 can't go on d4. So that's another draw by insufficient material. So there's another situation where black has been checked by the knight. Black can move on g8, on g8, but in this case this knight won't be occupying the g8, it's only controlling the f8, h8, and then these other three squares, which is e5, f4, h4. So the king, this is not a checkmate, so a king can go to g8. So this becomes a draw because white has only has one piece to attack the king, meaning the king can move to any other squares that it wants to, which is not occupied by the knight. So it's checked with the knight on g6, king moves on g8. If the knight moves on, if it moves to an e7 square with a check, the king will just move to f7. So that is another draw because you can't checkmate with just the knight. So this game can also be a draw by virtue of threefold repetition, which is called perpetual checks. So if it's white to play, white goes on e8 where the arrow is pointing. It's a check. White attacks the king moves to h7. So the white queen goes back to h5, check again. So the king goes back to g8. White does the same thing, goes on e8. Black goes on h7 with the king. White goes back with the queen on h5. So it's a repetition. You're just repeating the same moves over and over again. In this instant, it's also a draw by threefold repetition. So it doesn't necessarily mean if you have a lot of materials on the board, you can't fight for a draw. In this case, black has the rook, the queen, and the pawn on the third rank, which is a very, very strong pawn. So white only has 3 pawns and the queen. So white had to fight for a draw. So either fight for a draw or lose a game. So in this case, white decided to fight for a draw. This is how it was played on the threefold repetition. So the queen moves to e8, the king moves to h7. So it's repeated again. So this is another checkmate because you both have the same pieces on the board. So if white stops checks, black starts. So eventually you're going to capture each other pieces and then you're just going to remain with 2 kings on the board. So this is also a draw unless your opponent makes a mistake. So this is a theoretical draw. As you can see, black will always be moving, white will always be looking for checks. But in this case, if black decides to play on d5, the king on d5, then this one, white wins because white is just going to come on b3 with the queen check. And then, like in this instance like this, because the king is going to be too far from the queen to protect it, so it's just going to be captured and then white wins. But if you don't want your piece to be captured, you have to be closer to the king all the time. So instead of moving on d5, you just move on e5. If white decides to come with a queen on e3 check, you just move back, you just move down on e7. So the king moves on e6, the queen comes on b3 check, the king moves on e7. You are closer to the queen so that in case your opponent decides to capture your piece, then you're able to capture back, and then it becomes a draw by insufficient material on the board. So thank you for listening. We come to the end of the session. We'll see you in the next video session.